Chapter 5. Marina asked herself how she had come to this awful place. At the moment, the interior of this farmhouse did not appear terrible, but she had a feeling it would soon be full of horror. It had been commandeered for use as a field hospital. She had, in a manner of speaking, volunteered to remain and help. She looked at the face of the young second lieutenant, the company surgeon here. He'd ordered all the furniture moved to the backyard except for two tables for use in surgery. Now he fussed about it, examining his instruments, now and then glancing out the open door or a side window. Two privates stood by, waiting for orders. All three wore clean white aprons. She moved to look out the window for herself. In this early dawn, she could see men moving in the distance, but couldn't tell their uniforms. The clothing of both sides looked so much alike anyway. A lot of the rebels wore civilian dress. "What is this place called?" she asked the surgeon. He looked distracted, picked up a scalpel to test its edge on his thumb. "Wilson's Creek," he answered absently. It was all happening so fast. 3 days ago, she had been at the theater in St. Joseph, singing and meeting important people. She had spoken to General Fremont. That was after the concert, at a private soiree. "I understand you are newly arrived in Missouri," the general said. "I trust you find your stay a pleasant one." "I've been here for a week or so. After the stage ride from California, I never wanted to travel again, but I had thought to take the railroad back to Washington. I would truly like to see for myself what's going on there." Fremont's smile was pure charm. "There's more going on here in Missouri than back east. Perhaps you should consider staying a while." "I've not quite decided yet. Do you think there will be more fighting in Missouri, sir? I thought everything was under control here." He sipped at his champagne. "Under control for the moment, as long as General Lyon doesn't go stirring up trouble again." "Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. Wasn't he responsible for the St. Louis massacre? That's where a lot of the trouble started." Fremont stared across the room, as if thinking of something else. "The man's a fool," he said softly. "I heard he once slaughtered some Pomo Indians back in California." Fremont gave her a sharp glance. "You say you want to find out what's going on? Perhaps you should go talk to Lyon. I could arrange for you to ride out with a medical wagon." That was how she had come to be here. She had not expected a battle. Fremont had ordered Lyon not to engage the enemy, or so she'd heard. She had come out with the thought of entertaining the Union troops and perhaps meeting the general. By the time the medical wagon arrived, there were already troops on the move. From the other side of the field, there was a thunderous roar. It was the first time she'd heard a cannon fired, except for occasional salutes out at the San Francisco Presidio. This was closer and terrifying. They were firing live shots. In the distance, men were yelling. For no reason, she thought of her friend Emperor Norton. She wondered that she could have ever thought him mad. What was happening here and now was madness. The sun had just cleared the horizon, throwing long, stark shadows across the fields outside. Marina, being in the theater, had rarely seen the world this early in the morning. Last night, she had slept for only 3 hours or so, fully dressed, in the ambulance. She had a sudden thought that perhaps this was all an ugly dream from which she would shortly awaken, yawn, and go back to sleep. If only it were so. The lieutenant, she tried to recall his name, Grady or O'Grady, or perhaps Brady, saw her arrive with the medical wagon the previous evening. He'd assumed she was a nurse and began issuing orders, which she did her best to follow. She'd even helped to put up the hospital tent behind the farmhouse. Lieutenant Brady, if that was his name, seemed on a constant nervous edge. She did not believe he had slept at all. Across the field, there was a rattle of musket fire and more shouts. A short time later, the first casualties arrived. Later, she could recall only bits and pieces of that morning, bright but solitary images with blank spaces between. There was the soldier who walked in by himself, clutching his bloody arm. She had cut off his jacket and got him to lie on a table. The man had made no sound at all. The surgeon showed her how to give chloroform while he performed an amputation. It was done quickly, over with before she knew it. The two enlisted men got him off the table and into the other room before he was fully awake. Another took his place. At first, she was puzzled why some of the wounded were treated at once and others not. Some the surgeon merely examined for a moment, then directed the stretcher bearers to carry out to the tent. Then she overheard his comment as he leaned over a young soldier and pulled open the boy's jacket. Stomach wound? Put him out in the tent. She understood. There was nothing to be done for stomach wounds. There was a lull in the fighting, judging by the lack of noise outside, yet the casualties kept coming. Marina glanced down once at her own white apron and realized it was soaked in blood. Her dress would not be much cleaner. She leaned over a grizzled sergeant who was thrashing on the table, only half conscious, while she held him down. The surgeon's saw made a rasping sound on bone. Then, at some point, a man in captain's uniform came through the door. Get ready to evacuate, he ordered. The army's pulling back to Springfield. The lieutenant nodded, intent on the stitches he was putting in a severed arm stump. Who won the battle? Marina asked. She surprised herself by speaking. The captain shrugged. Damned if I know, miss. Looks to me like nobody won. I was hoping I might meet General Lyon here. He gave her a strange look. Better hope you don't, miss. He's dead. Then he turned and was out the door. She found herself somehow back in Springfield. She could not quite remember getting there. She was looking out a parlor window at the busy street below. One of the medical officers had arranged for her to room with his wife, a citizen of Missouri and a Union sympathizer. She remembered that much. What was the woman's name? Oh, yes, Amanda. That was it. Marina watched the traffic outside, the constant movement of army wagons and marching troops. Ready for some breakfast, miss? Marina turned at the voice of Amanda's maid, Julia. It was coming back to her. This place was so confusing. Julia was a slave, yet Amanda was for the Union. Missouri was a border state, half of one mind and half another. Where's your lady? Marina asked. I mean, Amanda. Down at Army headquarters, seen to her husband. He's that busy these days. The missus hardly gets to see him. She takes him a hot lunch every day, she does. Marina decided she was hungry, though in some ways this fact astonished her. There had been times in the last few days when she thought she could never stand the sight of food again. She followed Julia to the dining room. Julia brought her some poached eggs and toast. Julia, has there been any news? What about Wilson's Creek? Who won the battle? Julia frowned, as if thinking. Well, miss, from what I hear, the rebels say they won the battle, but they're not advancing. That's what I hear. I guess the army's still running things, but then I'm not the one to ask. Marina had a feeling that Julia might be better informed than a lot of white people she worked for. Who's running Springfield with General Lyon gone? Julia shrugged and said she surely didn't know. Marina dropped her questions. If Amanda returns, you may tell her I went to visit the hospital after breakfast. Thank you, Julia. That will be all. Marina finished her breakfast in silence, then left the house. She could remember the hospital. The place had been worse than anything she could have dreamed in a nightmare. She could still remember the screams and moans. She knew she had been there a long time, trying to help, cleaning blood, bringing water to dying soldiers, carrying bandages, and other tasks she did not wish to recall. She wasn't sure how long she had been there, or how long it was since she had left. She thought she had been sleeping for a day or two. She had no trouble finding her way there. It was a commandeered warehouse on the edge of town. She steeled herself to the screams and moans that she expected. Yet when she arrived at the front door, it was oddly quiet. A Union corporal stood guard at the front door. May I enter? I am a nurse. The soldier nodded. Yes, ma'am. I know. Go on in. For a moment, she wondered when and how she had become a nurse. The words had come automatically to her lips, though she knew nothing of medicine. Inside, the light was dim. An army surgeon was moving from one bed to another, making notes in a thick book. He gave a strained smile when he saw her. Back already? I see. I hope you had some rest. She did not recognize the man. She glanced down the row of beds, or rather pallets. Most of them were simply mats on the floor. Why are so many beds empty? It's so quiet in here. He shook his head. What do you expect? A lot of our casualties have died. They're all buried by now. What's left, the lucky ones, we've got a lot of them. The place is fairly under control, at least till the next battle. If you want to make yourself useful, why don't you go ask the sergeant what he wants you to do? She did that and spent the rest of the day performing what chores the orderly directed. She left the place after nightfall when the surgeon ordered her out. She meant to return to Amanda's house, not knowing where else to go, but she was distracted by music. Somewhere a man was singing. She turned aside, following the sounds. The singing stopped, followed by a polite applause. Marina strolled down one of the wider streets to the front of what appeared to be a music hall. She stood listening outside for a while. The singer was followed by someone playing a fiddle tune, some country melody she didn't know. It occurred to her that she had only a little money left. Of course, she wasn't being paid for her nursing duties. In fact, she remembered she had only a few clothes. What little luggage she had was somewhere back in St. Joseph. She had planned to spend only a day or two in Springfield. How long had she been here now? A week? Or was it 2? She made up her mind and entered the door of the hall. The place was filled mostly with soldiers, with a few women and some civilians. Heads turned to examine her as she walked down the aisle. It occurred to her they were noticing her bloody dress. She looked only at the fiddle player. He was a young corporal, little more than a boy. As she approached, he glanced at her, but never stopped playing. She mounted the stage without a pause. She stood and studied the soldier's face as he played. When finally he came to the end of his piece, he looked at her and smiled. Do you know any Stephen Foster? She asked. How about Hard Times? Yes, miss, I surely do. And he struck a chord and began to play. She waited till he had gone through the first bar, then faced the audience and lifted up her voice. Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears, while we all sup sorrow with the poor. If someone had asked Marina how she could sing like this, she would have had no answer. She had not the least idea herself. Her voice took flight, independent of her weary body, free of pain or fear or even hunger. Her song floated on across the room, above the audience, through the air that was her breath, that issued from her throat, that moved across the crowd of men and women to be breathed in again by their lungs and hearts and souls. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times come again no more. When she came to the last verse and ceased to sing, the corporal put down his fiddle. For a moment, there was silence in the room. Marina had a sudden fear that her audience had no liking for her. Then someone in the back of the room began to clap. In another moment, every man and woman in the room were on their feet applauding. There were shouts of encore. Marina looked at the soldier with the fiddle. What's your name? Randall, miss. I'm Marina. Do you know more songs of Mr. Foster? Surely, ma'am. I know them all. Beautiful dreamer, then. And so she went on to sing 6 or 7 songs. She soon lost count. Randall was a fine violinist and a perfect accompaniment. He sensed exactly how to follow her pitch and tempo, as if they had rehearsed together for weeks. They ended finally with that Gold Rush song, Oh, Susanna. After each song, there had been coins tossed onto the stage. An officer wearing a colonel's brocade came up and formally thanked Marina for a fine recital. He gave her a low bow, then turned to the audience. All right, men, we've had a fine evening's entertainment. Let's hope this lady can come back again. But we're all up for early muster tomorrow, so let's all get back to camp. Look sharp now. Soon the audience had all filed out, the civilians leaving last. The corporal was putting his fiddle in its case. All this money on the stage, miss, it's properly yours. I'll pick it up for you. You may pick it up, but you must keep half. If not for your fiddle, I would not have been able to sing. He chuckled and began scooping coins into his cap. There were a few gold coins and a number of silver. They overflowed his cap. You'll have to take care of my half for me, miss. I might be going into battle tomorrow. I couldn't carry all that. You can count it later. Give me my half some other time. She poured the coins into her reticule. How will I find you again, Randall? He shrugged. Just ask for Randall, the fiddler. Everybody in the regiment knows me. Will you walk me back to the house where I'm staying? An honor, Miss Marina. On the way, she asked him where he was from. Born in Indiana, he said, but my pa took me out to California during the rush. He left my ma and 2 sisters back home. He was thinking of digging up enough gold to pay for their passage west, but then he up and died of typhus. So I've been working in a sawmill up in Columbia till the war got started. Funny how many folks I've met from California, here, Missouri. I suppose you know Fremont was military governor of California for a while. Now he's the same thing here. General Lyon was from there too. Did you volunteer for the army, Randall? He grinned. Sure did. I was that weary of working in the sawmill. Maybe after the war I can get a passage back to Indiana. I miss my folks. How many battles have you been in, Randall? None so far. I was in the reserve force at Wilson's Creek, but we never got called up. I guess next time I won't be so lucky. She felt a chill, as if something dark had passed overhead. Will you be at the music hall again tomorrow, Randall? Again, the wide grin. Count on it, miss. Unless I have to fight, that is. Please, call me Marina. Next day, she went down to meet the owner of the music hall. This was a large, stout person named Orville. He was friendly enough and managed in a few minutes of conversation to relate most of his life story, apparently taking it for granted that she would be interested. He had worked as a carnival barker and traveling snake oil salesman, among other occupations. Now he was doing well in entertainment, especially since he didn't need to pay most of his performers. Orville had heard her performance the evening before, and he was eager for her return. In half an hour of negotiation, during which she made sure he got several good looks at her ankles, he finally agreed to pay her $1 for each performance, plus what was tossed on the stage. Then she insisted he pay Randall as well if he were able to show up. Orville balked at that idea, so she shrugged and got up to leave. Orville relented. There were no battles that day, at least that she heard about. She thought of going back to the hospital, but decided she needed some time away from that place. She told herself she would return if really needed. Then she tried not to think about it. That evening, as arranged, she met Randall at the back door of the music hall. He was cheerful and looked rested, though he said he'd spent most of the day marching in formation and practicing with the bayonet. Music always perks me up. They were to be the second attraction that night after an amateur minstrel skit. The house was packed. There were soldiers and civilians standing around the sides of the room. Orville approached them, mopping his brow with a bandana. Word gets around. This is a small town. They don't get many high-toned acts around here. Leastways, not since the Shakespeare Company last year. You're becoming famous, miss. They're calling you another Lotta Crabtree. She laughed. There's only one Lotta. Let's go make music, Randall. A sudden thought occurred to her. Randall, can you sing? He gave a solemn nod. Reckon so, miss. Marina? Or so I'm told. I'm a tenor. I do know a few songs. And so their duet was born. After her first two songs, with Randall's accompaniment, he put down the fiddle and they launched into an unrehearsed duet of Beautiful Dreamer, at first simply in alternating verses and finishing together, their two voices forming a perfect chord. He had one of the purest tenor voices she had ever heard. The audience went wild. She told herself they were hungry for any break from the terror and tedium of warfare, that they would have applauded swine squealing. And yet she knew as well that she and Randall were giving them a truly high-toned performance, one that would have done credit to New York or Philadelphia. She felt an upwelling of some new power within her, which she did not understand nor care to. They performed for another hour, mostly the same songs they had done on the previous evenings. They did not try another duet, but the audience seemed more than satisfied. This evening, there were more gold coins to be scooped up. Afterward, he again walked her home. She insisted he take some money, besides the $1 that Orville paid. She pressed upon him some gold, so he wouldn't need to carry so many coins. There was a small park or town square on the way with a single gas light. She invited him to sit a moment on a bench. He waited till she was seated, then sat as far away as possible. She laughed and moved closer. Did you ever hear of the emperor? She asked. The emperor of the United States. Oh, you mean that fellow, Emperor Norton? Sure, I heard of him. I even saw him once when I made a trip to the city. He's crazy, isn't he? Is he? He thinks there should be no war, especially between brothers. Does that make him mad? The more I see in Missouri, the more I wonder who is insane and who is not. How long do you think this war will last, Randall? He looked serious. They say not more than 6 months. The South can't hold out that long. My enlistment is only for a year. She turned on the bench to face him directly. She felt a deep certainty that something inevitable was about to happen between them. Randall, I want to continue making music with you. I want you to come with me after the war. He stared at her, as if unable to think of a response. He swallowed, then gave a long, slow nod. She seized both his hands. Come with me now. I don't want you to say anything, Randall. Just come with me at once. But don't forget your fiddle. Dearest Joshua, I can't afford the Pony Express, so I suppose it will be 3 weeks or so before you read this. Of course, there's no hurry. I'm writing this only to ease my own mind, since you are the only friend in whom I can fully confide. I'm still in Springfield, Many things have occurred since I came, too many to relate in a brief letter. I still volunteer a few hours a week at the hospital, a terrible place, but I'm glad to help. I know the soldiers appreciate seeing me there. There have been no major battles that I know of in Missouri, but the army is constantly harassed by bushwhackers, rebels who wear no uniform and have no military discipline, but who skulk in the bushes and ambush our soldiers. Fremont has declared martial law, but so far that seems to have little effect. I wonder how much of this news gets to California. Did you know that Fremont emancipated the slaves in the state, but Lincoln rescinded the order? It seems he is afraid of other border states turning southward. I wonder if this president truly knows what he is doing. But I did not wish to go on so about the war. I only wish you could stop this madness by means of proclamation. What I really want to tell you is that lately I've been happier than ever before, despite the turmoil around me. I've met a young man who is in the army and who is a fine musician. We plan to travel together when his enlistment is up. Marina put down her pen, wondering how much to put in this letter. It would hardly be seemly to tell him everything, how that night, after their first duet, she had led Randall to the horse barn behind Amanda's house, the building empty and unused since the animals had been pressed into military service. She could not tell Joshua of how they had climbed to the hayloft, she urging him on in whispers as if anyone might have overheard. The moon shone bright and nearly full through the open door, bathing the two of them in light like milk. Somewhere below, a mouse skittered across the floor. Please, undress, she told him. I want you to undress first. He opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it and complied. He helped her remove her own clothing, which took a good deal longer. She spread an old horse blanket across the stiff hay bristles, then lay down an unspoken invitation. That was a month ago. Since then, they had performed together at the music hall 2 or 3 times each week, and several times at Randall's regimental camp. He had been a virgin, unlike herself. He was, after all, 4 years younger than she. They had made love. How many times? She had lost count, but thought it might be 6. Once a week or so, he'd been absent, out on patrol. He told her he'd yet to fire a shot in anger. She had tried singing solo, but it was not the same. She knew she could sing the same songs, but not the same music. Never again. Marina looked out the window of her room in Amanda's house at the setting sun. For the moment, she forgot the letter she was writing. She hugged herself and began to laugh.